grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm one of your hosts, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating, not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Hi and welcome to Adopt Perspective. I'm your host, Jo Sparrow. If I had to pinpoint the moment that adoption really reared its head in a disruptive way in my own life, it would start with the experience of motherhood. This period in an adopted woman's life is also of great interest to today's guest, social worker and academic at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Jenny Conrick. Prior to becoming an academic, Jenny had 30 years' experience as a social work clinician, manager and educator in the non-government and health sectors, providing services across the life cycle to those with an adoption, out-of-home care and trauma experience. She is a qualitative and mixed methods researcher, and her current areas of research interest include the impacts of legislative change on people in the child and family welfare domain. Jenny has undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in social work and social studies and a PhD in social work. She's an accredited member of the Australian Association of Social Workers and the Australian College of Social Workers and the Australian Association of Infant Mental Health. Welcome to Adopt Perspective, Jenny. How accomplished are you?
Oh dear. Thanks, Jo. It's a real pleasure to be here.
We're lucky to have you. Jenny, how did you become interested in studying the mothering experience of adopted women?
Well, across my career, I've worked in various contexts within the child and family welfare field. And from time to time, I'd meet women and hear about their life experiences, and inevitably, a number of them were adopted. And later, I worked in the Adoption Information Service in the Department of Human Services, and I became very curious from what I was hearing from clients of that service to see what the literature had to say about adopted people in adulthood, and particularly when they were parents. And what I found at that time was very little. It was almost as if adoption wasn't recognised in adults, that adults had become a hidden group in our community. And certainly adopted women as parents were just not on the agenda, except for one small study that I found from Sydney by Masso and Whitfield. So in 2010, as part of my master's social work degree, I thought I would conduct a small pilot study about adoption and motherhood. Firstly, to see if there were any women I could find who'd be interested, and then to see if they would want to speak to me, and then also to hear about any needs that they saw that they had currently. And on the strength of those findings, and I had 3 very generous women who spoke to me, I went ahead and started my larger PhD study.
Fantastic, thank you. Just looking at the larger picture for a moment, I noted that your study responds to recommendations made in a couple of reports calling for further systematic inquiry into all areas of adoption practice and policy. Can you tell us about this and why more research is needed?
Yes. So by the time I was involved in my PhD study, the findings from several significant national inquiries and reports were being released. And of particular note was the Senate inquiry into former forced adoption policies and practice, 2012, and the AFE study conducted by Kenny on the impacts of past adoption experiences. So I was very fortunate that this was happening. because they really brought to public notice and attention the experiences of all members of the adoption circle, so adopted people, mothers, fathers, and other relatives. These reports really pointed to almost the hidden costs of adoption for these people, and it also really pointed to the fact that adoption is just not a once-off event that happens to babies and adult parents, but it's a status and a way of being that impacts across the lives of people, and that that often people who have been adopted may not understand some of the things they are experiencing at particular times in their lives. They can't make sense of them, nor see necessarily that they're related to their adoption experiences. And they're not necessarily getting the right sort of support at that time from people who really have an understanding of the deep impacts of adoption. And I think, I think that all of those impacts are still needing a lot of research, particularly with adults and ageing adults. And it really also says that the more we understand, I would hope the more policy and practices can change, particularly with adults, and that there's more support, a better understanding by professionals of what's needed.
Thank you. Yeah, there really is a dearth in this area of study. So thank you for stepping into that. Jenny, what can you tell us about how we think of motherhood and mothering in Australia?
Yes. What an interesting question. So I actually looked up the definition of mothering in the Oxford Dictionary, and it said mothering is bringing up a child with care and affection. And this means meeting the practical and the emotional needs of that child throughout their childhood, and embedding them in a network of family, friends and wider community that provide them with a whole lot of resources as they're developing, not only in childhood but beyond. So who fills this role of mothering, of course, has often been women, but in this day and age, these roles and tasks can be fulfilled by all sorts of people within a family. And a family, I still believe, is one of the strongest units in society, no matter how it's constituted. And we know that we have a variety of families. Often the tasks are not only determined by who's in the family, but also by cultural norms and social determinants. So I think we've got quite a diverse array of biological families and also social families. And within those, various people perform this nurturing and affection and social connection roles.
That's interesting, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. And I think families, motherhood brings with it its own challenges for everybody, whoever performs those roles. And I think there are still challenges, and they're added to by housing demands, work demands. But I think for women who are adopted as they parent, there's always the added overlay of the re-emergence of adoption issues, and then trying to incorporate those as they develop and define how they want to be a mother.
Yeah. So what were you specifically addressing or with the study, or what were you trying to find out?
So this was an exploratory study. As you said, there's been a dearth of studies in this area, and I really wanted to hear from the women themselves. I wanted them to tell me what the issues were from their perspectives, because they were a hidden group. And so I looked to them as my teachers. And it was almost as simple as that. Tell me what it's like. And while everything is very personal and individual, are there any common themes that come from your experiences that might be of use to other adopted women and to practitioners who potentially want to support and assist.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how the study was conducted?
Yes. So I wanted to hear from women who were just out there in the general population. So my challenge initially was how to reach them. In Melbourne at that time, there was a magazine called Melbourne's Child, and it was a free magazine about health, education, recreation that was just placed in doctors' surgeries, maternal and child health centres, hospitals. It was all over the place. And I thought I would advertise in that. And I put this tiny little ad in there because they were very expensive, asking women to contact me if they were adopted and interested in speaking about being a mother. And then over time, word got around and women were contacting me directly. So overall, I had about 45 responses to my ad and then the word of mouth. And 21 of those responses filled the study selection criteria, which was that the women were adopted in Victoria and that they still had children living at home. And I felt that was very important to make it current. And I would have loved to have interviewed women from other states, but I decided not to because each state has its own particular policies and procedures. And I thought that might just skew things a little. I also decided not to include inter-country adoptees at that point because I felt that cultural experience and racial experience were additional factors, and I would like to perhaps speak to inter-country adopted women at some point about their parenting experience. So that was how I got my participants, and I ended up with 18 women who I interviewed, and that was recorded and transcribed, and they had a look at all of that transcription and they decided what they want included and what they might want to change. And then there were 5 additional women who I didn't interview, and they formed a focus group. And once I had collated my findings and pulled out what I thought were themes, I then presented that to these 5 women, and they took an afternoon to discuss whether they felt those findings were valid and really captured what I'd been told.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you, you could get so expansive. You can get excited about research, can't you? You can think, oh, we'll get all these different people, but you really do have to hone it down, and then, it might spark future research into other areas that you couldn't cover.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what did you uncover about how the research participants felt and thought about being a parent?
Okay. So becoming a mother and being a mother awakened unexpected and a profound sense of grief, loss and abandonment. And women spoke about this catching them by surprise. And often this occurred after the birth of their first child, sometimes after the birth of a second child. It may have been influenced by the gender of their child. But at times, this sense that they felt at the beginning of parenthood re-emerged at other times. It seemed as if holding that infant child of theirs was like experiencing themselves as infants, and they wondered who had held them when they were that age and who had kept them in mind, and that was a great source of sadness for them. It also reawakened thoughts about their birth mothers and what it must have been like for them. And perhaps for the first time for several, it made them feel an empathy for their birth mother that they may not have felt previously. And several women also said that they thought about their adoptive mothers, many of whom had not had the experience of carrying biological children, and they felt a grief, I guess, for them. For all of the women, or a great number of them, their children were the first biological relatives with whom they'd had a really close relationship. And this was a profound experience. And they said being able to touch their child's face, being able to see themselves in that child was enormously profound. And one woman said she was actually quite angry with her husband at that point because their first child looked like him and not her. So she was quite miffed by that.
I can imagine.
I think too, so being a mother really did touch on a lot of adoption issues for them. And it certainly reawakened a desire to find out more about their early years and their first family. Some had reapplied for adoption records or tried to find out more records. Others began searching for first family or reigniting first family contact with all that came after that. The other thing that I think being a mother prompted was that they really saw a connection, a direct connection between the mother they wanted to be, their values, goals, hopes, and what they did as a mother, and their adoption experiences. They saw those early years in their adoptive family, their thoughts, their doubts, the way in which they were treated, that their access to information or lack of access to information as being very, very formative. So that, excuse me, they said they certainly had a fierce commitment to the family that they'd formed, that they would die for them. And they attributed this to being an adopted person. They said that they strove to be the best mothers they could be, and they placed a very high value on openness and honesty in their relationship with their children and partners, and they saw this as having to do with the perhaps lack of information they had. Part of being the best mother they could was their desire to avoid visiting any negatives from their childhood experiences to their children. So they wanted to mitigate any anxiety or depression they were experiencing. They wanted to mitigate that impact on their children. They also really tried to address any sense of inadequacy as a parent. You know, have I got a right to be this parent? Am I going to be good enough? By talking to other parents, by going to parenting classes. They were absolutely diligent in trying to improve that part of their lives. And of course, in all of these efforts, what they were also wrestling with was the question about their own identity and, again, where they fitted, and just who they were. And they had to re-look at all of that and reconfigure it in some way.
There is just so much in that I identify with. And I just thinking about the ones that were a little angry at their partner because their baby looked like them. I can recall when my first son was born, everyone coming to the hospital and all saying, "Oh, you didn't get a look in, Joe, looks just like Baden." And I was getting more and more upset by the moment, you know. But,
yes, and I think for some, because they were also commenting about family comments and how that was quite strange in some ways, because those sorts of comments couldn't be made about them in their adoptive families. And in fact, some of them had heard other comments, if there were biological children in the adoptive family, that those children looked like other relatives, and that then made them feel different and separate. But something some of the women, well, each of the women spoke about was their connection to their own children. And several women said that they were very anxious in those first months about leaving their children. One woman said she would not let anybody hold her child except her. And another woman said I actually said to her, you were a very attached mother to your child. And she said, attached? She said, I was super glued. I used to live with one foot in the crib. And she said that wasn't good after a while. So there was that experience. And then at the other end, there was another woman who said she had two sons, and she said she daren't let herself become too bonded to them within that first 2 years, because there was always that fear that there'd be a separation. Yeah. And it was only after their second birthday that she was able to relax. Yeah. So that was also very profound.
So did your participants report any mental health issues after becoming a parent?
They did. Mm-hmm. About 19 of them reported experiencing anxiety and or depression since becoming a parent. Several had said they'd experienced that on and off prior to parenting, but it became a feature. And they'd each sought help of one sort or another. So several women were still on medication, and they'd all sought counselling of one sort or another. And 3 women had been diagnosed with postnatal depression following the birth of a child. And that, given the percentage that I had 21 women in my study, that's actually a higher prevalence in that small group than in the general population at the time. And so that raised for me issues about what that was and whether it was this reconnecting with that sense of abandonment, or reconnecting with a feeling of how am I going to parent this child, doubting themselves. So it's a very complex space, I think, those early months and years. Yeah. Yeah. And the women were very concerned to shield their children from the effects of this anxiety, very fearful that they were going to visit this on their children. And one woman in my master's study actually said she was really concerned that her teenage child was starting to exhibit anxiety symptoms, and she was feeling so guilty and worried that she was the cause of this. Yeah. So there was an overlay of guilt and concern and vigilance about what they might give to their children, I guess.
Yeah. Jenny, I know in my own experience, whether to have children or not was something that I thought long and hard about, and conceiving a child was difficult for us. It took a number of years, and I would refuse to have anything to do with IVF. I couldn't participate in anything that heightened that. And people even asked me, would you adopt a child? I was like, no. I could never have separated my experience from that of a child that I brought in. So I'm just wondering, did you find that adoption had impacted your participants' decision to have children?
Good question. In the PhD group, that wasn't a strong finding. Most of the women said that they had wanted children. There was one who was ambivalent, but then had her children. I think they felt quite strong about not adopting, although in my master's group, one of those participants had actually adopted her 2 children after trying various means of having children biologically. And that was something, again, she was extremely committed to her children and felt that her own personal experience assisted her in mothering her children. But there are other studies, and I think the Masso and Whitfield study that I mentioned before, and certainly the Kenny study, do talk about that and because they had a wider pool as well of women they spoke to, that some women really did consider long and hard, would they parent or not? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it'll be. We were having a little chat before we started recording, and it'd be so interesting to extend this into male and other adoptees to see, how it's impacted them in that way as well.
Absolutely. I mean, my dream would be to do a much broader study, because this is so small, and what I'm speaking about today is really only pertinent to the group of women who participated. So to know how broad these experiences are and how diverse would be wonderful. Yeah. To know men's experiences would be fabulous, because men are often more reluctant to speak about these things. To understand the intergenerational experience, the children of adopted people, what's their experience? And now some of those children will be having their own children, and what's that flow-on experience? So any funding out there, anyone interested in studying and wants a supervisor, I'm interested as well.
I'm interested. My hands up.
Because I think it is still such a hidden part of our community, but the ripple effect is so broad, and there's so much to be learned from people's experience about other parts of life, such as IVF, such as surrogacy, and people in out-of-home care. And we need to understand it, because people suffer throughout their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did their experiences of motherhood impact the relationships that your participants had with their adoptive family members and others?
Yes, good question. One of the things that I noted at the beginning, I actually mapped the early experiences of each of these participants as far as they knew before they joined their adoptive families, and then asked them about their early experiences with their adoptive families, because I felt both of those areas impacted not only on motherhood but also on their later relationships with their adoptive families. So what surprised me, I guess, because the average age of the women in the study was about 44, was that all of the women had spent the early weeks, often up to 3 months of age, in hospital care, in baby home care, and only, I think, one had pre-adoptive foster care, but they'd all had several types of care before they joined their adoptive families. And that raised for me the impact, what we now know about the impact of stress on the developing brain of young infants, and what that left them with, that their adoptive parents most likely were not supported to understand or address. So that was one question. The other was their experiences with their adoptive families. And a number of participants said that they'd had pretty good adoptive experiences. There was then a middle group who said, look, they were okay, but there were difficulties. Difficulties because I think 2 had lost adoptive parents through death by the time they were 10. One had an adoptive parent with mental health issues. One had an adoptive parent with a hidden alcohol problem. And then there were 3 who had experienced sexual abuse or abuse of one sort or another. So these experiences really impacted not only on parenting and their mental and emotional well-being, but also on subsequent relationships with their adoptive parents. So what was very significant was whether their adoptive parents could step up to the plate and be good, in inverted commas, grandparents. If they were interested, attentive, positive grandparents, that really scored a lot of points with my women. If they had been there to support their daughters, their adopted daughters, following the birth of their children, that often changed and turned around some fragile relationships and strengthened them. And there was one woman I recall who had been the youngest in a family where the other children were birth children, and they were much older than her, and she'd had a fairly fiery and challenging relationship with her adoptive parents. And when she fell into depression with her first child, they were there every day, and they and her husband worked out a regime that supported her, the baby and the family, and that absolutely changed the relationship and dynamic. So that was very, very important. And I think the other thing that really stood out was adoptive parents' responses when the women in the study started searching again and making contact with birth family members. And if the adoptive parents were open and able to manage that, the relationship had a more positive tone. But if they didn't, then there was a part that the women cut off from them. Another factor also was that their adoptive parents were ageing, and so a number of the women were sandwiched between caring still for their own children of varying ages and also caring for their adoptive parents. So, and also negotiating perhaps birth family contacts. So that just added yet another layer of stress at this time of mothering.
Yeah, because that is often the case, isn't it? That adoptive parents are a lot older. Yeah,
exactly. And one woman who didn't necessarily draw that connection between her adoption experience and her motherhood experience, but she took part in the study, which was great, and I valued her perceptions because she had the youngest child in the group. She had a 6-month-old child as well as 2 older children. She also had her adoptive parents living with her, and one had a mental health issue. And she said she just could not afford to make any connections at the moment because she was so busy and so flat out. She felt once she knew what things were like, then she might be overwhelmed. So that was interesting because in a way she was saying her fear was that adoption was going to have a lot of meaning for her.
And yet she put her hand up to participate in this study. Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, she was wonderful. And she brought her 6-month-old along to the interview and we managed.
That would have been interesting.
Eating, crying, sleeping. It was excellent. It was good.
Yeah, she was in the thick of it.
Yeah.
What about partners? Did the participants have anything to say about the role their partners play?
Lots. Lots. So partners, I think the average length of partnership was 17 years, which was pretty good at that time. One partner for 17 years. Several were divorced, but nevertheless, their partner was still very important in their lives and the lives of their children. So partners were so important as supporters for them. Those who had positive partnerships, they felt that partner really had got to know them and supported them and had an understanding of those deep issues that no one else had. Although one participant said, of course, when you're in a partnership, you've got to open up to that partner. And so for her, that took her a long time to be able to open up and trust to that herself to that partnership. Another woman had felt she had a good relationship with her partner, but just before the interview, he apparently said to her, if only I had known what it was like for an adopted person, I don't think I would have married you, which was a devastating comment, but also I thought said so much about the things she struggled with and the stresses on that relationship. And that was a very sad story. Yeah. For those who were separated, they wanted their partners to be involved in the lives of their children. They felt it was so important that their children had that connection knew where they came from, no secrets like they had. And everybody put a lot of value on their partners as good fathers. They had to be good fathers. And that was fascinating.
Yeah, that's incredible. Your participant group included adoptees who were told from a young age that they were adopted, as well as late discovery adoptees.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether this played a role in their experience of being mothers.
Yes. All but one of my participants were adopted in a closed system just before change of legislation. And I had one person who was adopted in the 80s under the more open Victorian adoption system, where a lot more information was given to her adoptive parents, where access could have occurred if parties wanted it to occur. So the majority of women had adoptive parents had very little information about the circumstances of their child's separation from their first family. And so they had very little information to give their children growing up. And so they gave their children a story about what the circumstances were. And of course, later, as the women searched and found information, many of those stories were overturned or expanded upon. So there was a real sense that they'd been lied to, that things had been hidden, that they wished they had known those circumstances and had that information, and that growing up, some of their thoughts and internal musings and desires to know their story may have been more realistically felt and experienced had they that information. So that really said to them they didn't want secrets within their own families. So they valued this openness and transparency. Also, for those adopted in that closed system, they were very aware, as I mentioned before, of what Amanda Baden calls microaggressions. They were very aware of comments from extended family members or people in the community, often not meant to hurt, but comments about whose eyes someone might have or whose hair they've got and what deceased family member they might resemble. And they were very aware that that was not them, that comparison couldn't be made. And those little aggressions really impact their sense of identity and sense of belonging, sense of difference. And that, of course, then was something that they wanted to redress as parents within their own family. There were two people, three really, who found out later in life. One woman was in primary school, I think, so that was a shock to her. She spoke about that shock, more than a shock, but she was still a child, and it did have an impact on, and she as a child and unsupported, of course, had to make sense of that. There was another who was told much later in life as a young adult. In fact, there may have been two as young adults. That was pretty devastating. And they looked to friends to try and make sense of that. And they had to, again, felt that they couldn't understand why their parents may not have told them. They did, but they didn't. And they wondered about being lied to. And then there was another woman who found out much later after the birth of her child, and I think it was at the death of one of her adoptive parents. And that really, she said, that actually turned things on her head, on their head, really. She had to really go back and make a whole lot of sense of what had happened. And she then outreached immediately to try and understand and make her roots and make contact with family. And sadly, all along the way, she missed people. Her birth mother had died a few years after their separation. That particular woman had also made contact with a birth uncle in another country, and she travelled to meet him, but he died 2 weeks before she was to travel. And there were just these little misses all along the way. So that then really added, I think, to how she was wanting to reform her understanding of being a parent to her her teenage child at the time.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
Mm. Mm.
For those who knew from a young age they were adopted, were the stories they were told about how they came to be adopted a significant aspect of the study? And if it was, in what way?
Yes, I think the stories were often about being special. And one woman said that was a great comfort as a child. She thought she really was very special, whereas others felt they didn't want to be special. They wanted just to be part of it all. One or two who had abusive upbringings were more or less told that they hadn't come from good people. And that was not, of course, a good thing for them. It impacted their whole sense of who they were. But I think it was the lack of information. So questions couldn't be answered. They couldn't ground some of their fantasies in real information. And so they imagined all sorts of things. And then later in life, they had to readjust that and reconfigure it, with reality.
Yeah.
I think that was a big thing.
Yeah. So, Jenny, overall, what do you feel are the takeaways about the meaning that adopted women draw from their experiences when parenting their own children?
Yes. So that's a good one. So each person, each woman in the study had an individual meaning, I guess, based on her own personal experience. And so that varied. And it's important to keep in mind that meanings do change over time. So that was something I noticed. So just as we've spoken about, the person who felt special, adoption had a particular meaning during her childhood, and that changed in adulthood. And she felt robbed, I think, and that she'd missed out, and that the state certainly had a say in something it should never have had a say in. But then everyone also realised that the moral and social values of the times. So that's one thing. But I think that the big message was that their motherhood experiences and their aspirations as mothers were shaped in some way by their adoption status. That being a mother reawakened many feelings about themselves, their identity, their adoption, where they fitted. And that had to all be managed as well as at the time of doing this important task of parenting their children. And what really came out, I think, was that adoption has a lifelong impact in almost every aspect of people's lives, and that people can go along and live, quite comfortably for a time, and then a particular change in life, such as becoming a mother or parenting, can reawaken these things. So it's something that I'm imagining might impact right until the death of a person. And I must say, in my private practice at the moment, the adopted people I'm speaking to are now people in their 50s and 60s, and all of a sudden, things that they've been quite happy with have re-emerged again, and they need just to reconfigure and rework things.
Yeah. It's the saying that we have at Jigsaw, is that adoption is a lifelong experience. Yes. And sometimes it, ebbs and flows in your life. It's certainly been my experience.
Yes.
It raises its head and then it becomes less important, but it's always there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I know it would have been of great benefit to me if I'd known that adoption could affect me as a mother.
Yes.
Can we go back 21 years and start over? So one of your initial questions of inquiry was to look at whether the experience of parenting is a time when additional emotional or other assistance is needed. Yeah. What did you discover?
Well, the women in the study, they told me what they needed. So they gave me 5 things, really. They said that they wanted the opportunity to speak about their adoption and to tell their story while they were parenting. It really became an urgent thing for them to be able to speak about it. They wanted their experiences, not just as a mother, but as an adopted person over their lifetime, to be validated and listened to and acknowledged. And they wanted to unravel the impact of the adoption for them, because they felt that was important not only for their own well-being, but for their children and the family they'd created as a whole. And they really wanted to speak to someone who had an understanding of adoption matters. Not just anybody would do. They had to, and they were very alert to who they felt could really listen and understand. They said their antennae were out and they knew. And they also said that what they would have loved was for there to be information during the antenatal period about how adoption might impact. A little leaflet in that book of information that you get during that period. And I think too, postnatally, for maternal and child health nurses or obstetricians, gynaes in follow-up appointments, to have that information if people need it. But they also, I think services, doctors, clinicians, anybody, they have to know if people are adopted. So they need to ask that question. Yeah. And often that question isn't asked. People then have the choice about whether they disclose that or not. But to even ask a woman before or after the birth of children might be a great help. And there might be all sorts of things that they want to speak about. So I think there needs to be additionally more information for practitioners about what it means to have an adoption experience, no matter where you are. And services need to be adequately funded to provide support at various points of time. So not just 8 to 10 sessions, but because some of these issues are so profound, they take time to unravel. And often adopted people can find it hard to trust, and they need to know, from what the women I've spoken to have told me and from my experience in my counselling, they need to know that they are safe in that counselling relationship, and that can take time. So there needs to be that support, I think, and funding. Yeah. And I guess also what these women in my study pointed to was there needs to be more research. We need to hear a lot more from people who have an adoption experience about what it's like. We can't just assume that it's like this or like that. We need to hear from people who know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would have saved me a lot of heartbreak. I can look back in hindsight now and see some things I did and the way things unfolded for me, that if there'd been a resource or someone I could talk to have those things brought to my attention at the time, it would have saved me, a lot of regret now.
And also support for partners, perhaps, who might be quite baffled by what their partners are going through and who may not know how to support them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's very important, I think.
Intercountry Adoptee Voices, we spoke to Linnell Long last year, I think, and last season, and they've just put out some fantastic video resources for professionals in education and in the medical and mental health fields. And it's a series of interviews and asking questions, and those adoptees sharing their experience, with the idea that it can start to get that information disseminated out there. And while it's all intercountry adoptee voices, a lot of the things that they've experienced can be across the broader general adoptee experience. So
absolutely. And a couple of years ago, when I lived in a regional area in Australia, I met two young adopted people, and they were locally adopted. And so we have very few of those young people these days. I think about 200 across Australia a year. But what really struck me, each of them had an open adoption, and they knew birth family members. Nevertheless, they had never met another adopted person. They still had many of the queries and concerns that my older adopted people that I know have, and they had no one to speak to. They might speak to a parent, but they had nowhere else. And I thought, look, we still have people coming through the system, if you like, who need that additional support.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in regional Queensland for a large part of my life. And while I had 3 adopted cousins and eventually a niece and a nephew who were adopted, we didn't discuss it in family.
No.
I felt like it wasn't something we could discuss. And so I didn't know any adopted people until I started going to jigsaw support groups. And, I was well into adulthood when that happened.
Yeah. And that makes me think of something else that the women in my studies spoke about, and that was the openness. When we were speaking about the messages that they received growing up, sometimes there was a lack of openness about discussion. There wasn't that deep freedom to ask anything and not feel guilty or concerned about their adoptive parents' reaction. And Hal Grotevand, who's a researcher in America, he's been conducting the Minnesota longitudinal adoption study. So I think his participants are now in their 30s or 40s perhaps. And he speaks about the need for that openness and how that can be so important and supportive for young adopted people as they're growing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Jenny, there's just so many important points that we raised today, and I'll have to have a look at how long this has gone for, and I might end up making it into 2 episodes because I'm not going to lose 1 minute of it. Do you have any plans to take this research further?
Jo, I would love to broaden this study to a national one. As I mentioned, I would really like to see whether the themes that have come out from this wonderful small group of women who were so generous with their time is applicable to a wider group of people. I would love to hear from men, as I said, about their fatherhood experiences, from children of adoptees about being children of adopted people, but also if they're now parents, what is the ripple effect for them? I really think we need to understand more about the reunion process, because that's not something we've touched a lot on here. But reunion, as it unfolds over the years, is a very tricky and challenging thing. And that's what also impacted the women in my studies' experiences as they parented. It could be a joyous thing. It could be a very difficult and challenging and sad thing that prompted again feelings of abandonment. So I think that's really good. And it's so important to follow through with the recommendations from the AFES report, that we need to do more Australian research. But to do that, we need funding. So we need government or philanthropics or wherever to be able to say, yes, this is important and let's do this. Yeah. And I would love to engage young researchers in this process, because we need people moving forward as well.
Yeah. Listen up, anyone who's thinking of doing their PhD.
Absolutely, give me a call.
And, Jigsaw, in any way we can assist with that happening, I would be so excited to see those things go forward. So if there's any way we can help, we would love to be involved. I personally would love to be involved.
love to be involved with you, Jo.
Look, Thank you so much for your time this morning. I know you're very busy, particularly at this time of year. And thank you so much for your interest in this area and for considering going forward with more of it, because it is needed, because there is a cost that goes on for generations to society. So it's something we need to understand and we need to look at and help heal people so that it doesn't keep reverberating through generations.
Exactly. And Jo, thank you so much for inviting me. It's just wonderful to be able to talk about something so important. And I would really like to acknowledge and thank the women who were part of my PhD and my master's. They were so generous. They opened their souls, really. And you know who you are, and you've made a great contribution, I think, to learning.
Yeah, big thank you from me too.
Yeah.
And we'll put up some relevant links about Jenny's research on our podcast notes page, so be sure to check them out. It's fascinating reading. Before we say goodbye, though, do you have a story that you'd like to share with us? If you do, jump onto the main podcast page of the Jigsaw Queensland website and complete the prospective guest form that you'll find there. And note that Adopt Perspective can be listened to by people all over the world. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.